On behalf of the Institute for Peace and the Austrian Institute for International Affairs, I want to welcome you to this talk on nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. My name is Heinz Gärtner. I'm chairing the advisory board of the International Institute for Peace, and I'm affiliate to the Austrian Institute for International Affairs. We have a special guest today because there were two conferences on disarmament and non-proliferation, and we have an expert today who follows closely these developments on nuclear issues. And I want to welcome Tom Sauer. He is professor in international politics at the University of Antwerpen. He also was a former fellow at Harvard University at the International Security Program, but he also was a visiting fellow at the European Union Institute for Security Studies in Paris. And most important of all, of course, he is also member of the board of the International Institute for Peace. Tom Sauer published widely, not only, but widely on nuclear disarmament, on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and non-proliferation. So the list of publications is very long, so I will not go into it. We can look at his website and you will find out. I just want to add, Tom Sauer calls himself also an engaged scientist, especially when it comes to this nuclear disarmament. As I mentioned, we had in the last 2 months very important conferences on these issues. So one was in the end of June, the conference of the state parties to the Treaty of the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the so-called PEN Treaty. This treaty entered into force in January 2021, and so far it has 65 ratifications and 89 signatories. It calls for the total elimination of nuclear weapons. And in Vienna, they adopted the so-called Vienna Declaration and an action plan of 50 points. I have to say, however, none of the nuclear weapon states or allies to the nuclear weapon states joined the treaty. That's the caveat of the treaty. Second, the end of last month ended the review conference of the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty in New York. It failed to adopt a final document officially because Russia could not agree to the phrases about the grave concerns when it comes to the military activities in Zaporizhzhia. The final document, the draft final document, of course, contains many elements which have been controversial in the past. So it does not appear this time. However, it also calls for nuclear weapon-free zones and a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East. I mentioned this because the 2015 conference, review conference, failed because of the resistance of the United States on this issue. But the draft document also mentions Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which calls for upon the member states for disarmament and negotiations in good faith. This is a controversial point between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. Interestingly enough, the draft treaty also talks about humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, which is the basis of the ban treaty. And also the draft document acknowledges that there is this treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. They seem to be non-controversial, but I'm sure they are controversial if you would discuss them in detail, and they were controversial during the conference. So we have these two conferences, and the question is the outcome and the impact of the conferences. So I want to ask Tom first, how would you compare these conferences? Would there be would you call it a success or a failure? What would be the impact now, or is there no impact altogether? Tom, please.
Okay, thanks, Heinz, for your questions and introduction. So the short answer is that the TPNW conference, the ban treaty conference in June, was a success. This is generally acknowledged. And the NPT Review Conference in August was, in my view, a gigantic failure. So that also corresponds to the expectations. Everybody expected that the TPNW, the ban treaty conference, would be a success because it's less controversial, because of the attendees are much more identical. They are all against nuclear weapons. These are all non-nuclear weapon states. So it's preaching for their own choir to a certain extent. But nevertheless, there were a few debating issues, whether Russia should be mentioned or not. But finally, they found an agreement, and the Vienna Declaration is really a multilateral statement that should be read. It's uncommon in these days to have such a document when the liberal world order is falling apart. So these are dozens of states that came together and agreed on an important declaration condemning, for instance, the nuclear threat by Russia, although not naming the state in particular. Apart from the declaration in Vienna, there was an action plan agreed upon. So looking forward to the future with concrete actions. And they will follow up these actions at the next conference in November 2023. Maybe another interesting aspect of that conference in Vienna in June was that at least some allied non-nuclear weapon states of NATO were present, not as a state party, but as an observer. Yeah? But I'm talking then about Norway, Germany, the Netherlands, and Belgium, my own country. And that was not so easy to convince our government to be present. My own government has not made a statement at the conference, but the three others, they did. So, and there was a constructive attitude, at least by these observer states. And by the way, also states like Switzerland, Finland, Sweden were also there as observers. So I believe 30 observing states and 40 member states parties together. Now, that was the easy one. The more difficult one was the NPT Review Conference, which was not the first one. It's a 10th review conference, and some of them have failed in the past. Some of them were successes when they agreed on a common final document by consensus. But last time, in 2015, it was a failure. And so everybody hoped, at least, that this time the member states would come together and agree on a consensus document. Also because it was 50 years ago that the treaty was signed and concluded. So it was an important meeting. Nevertheless, the end result is known. You have already mentioned that Russia, one of the nuclear weapon states, blocked consensus because of the situation at the nuclear power station in Ukraine. So the question could be asked, what if Russia would not have blocked? Would we have had a consensus document? We don't know. We don't know. But it seems that most states would have gone along with the text, which was so watered down that it was a lowest common denominator text with not much content, especially not with respect to nuclear disarmament. The main issue at the NPT review conferences in the past and also this year. It's about Article 6, the promise by the nuclear weapon states to get rid of nuclear weapons. It's a major part of the NPT deal in '68. And the non-nuclear weapon states, they criticize the nuclear weapon states of not fulfilling their part of the bargain, not disarming their stockpiles. And the nuclear weapon states defend themselves, saying that the security situation is such that they cannot do that. And the result is that we now, in 2022, still live in a world with 13,000 nuclear weapons, despite the promise of the nuclear weapon states to get rid of these nuclear weapons more than 50 years ago. So the patience of the non-nuclear weapon states is running out. They ask themselves, why should we keep fulfilling our obligations while you are not doing it? We are in a situation with a triple crisis. There's a nuclear arms control crisis, a nuclear disarmament crisis, and a nuclear proliferation crisis going on. And on top of that, there's this war caused by a nuclear weapon state on European territory, never seen since the Second World War, including nuclear threats by Russia. So one could expect at least that the minds of the negotiators were sharp and that they at least tried to have a final document with some meaningful results, and we didn't get that. And so that adds to this list of crises and problems in the nuclear governance field. And the future does look bleak, in my view.
Let me ask you, you're saying the review conference 22 failed. Let me ask you a little bit more specific, because you said the nuclear weapon states also failed to meet their obligations in Article 6, and that's why we have this PEN treaty, which wants to fill this legal gap between text and implementation. Would you say that a twofold question? Would you say that the Non-Proliferation Treaty now is failing altogether? And second, is the TPNW compatible with the NPT? Are there contradictions, or are they compatible? Of course, the architects of the TPNW would say, of course, they are compatible, and it's just some supplement to implement the Article 6. So what would you say? Is this the NPT now out of date? Is it compatible with the PEN treaty, or is there a contradiction?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me first answer your second question. As the architects of the TPNW make clear, the TPNW is perfectly complementary to the NPT. The NPT has as its goal nuclear disarmament, read nuclear elimination. That's the goal of the NPT, the end goal. And for that, it's logical that you, at a certain moment, start banning these weapon systems. And that's exactly what the TPNW did. So you can see the TPNW as an instrument to reach the goal of the NPT. And that's how it is regarded by the TPNW member states. For reasons that are clear to all observers, the nuclear weapon states do not agree with that interpretation, apparently, because of the simple reason that they are not ready for elimination. They believe that this TPNW treaty comes too soon. Yeah? They still cling to nuclear weapons for nuclear deterrence reasons. And here we are at the crux, of course, of the problem. And while the TPNW is complementary to the NPT in the short term, in the long term, of course, there is a problem of complementarity, because the TPNW asks the states to get rid of nuclear weapons, and they are banned according to the treaty. The NPT only regulates the transition period until global zero. Yeah? And during that transition period, the nuclear weapon states can keep their nuclear weapons and can keep clinging to their nuclear deterrence doctrines. Yeah? And that is, of course, not compatible in the long term. In the long term, the nuclear weapon states have to agree that nuclear deterrence should be outlawed, as the TPNW say. Yeah? And they're not ready for that. So that's why there's so much polarization going on, also due to the TPNW, although that was not meant to be the case. But of course, that's the reality. And also due to the reaction, the very negative reactions by the nuclear weapon states and the allies to the TPNW. They had a patronizing tone, very dismissive tone vis-à-vis the TPNW. That is only slightly changing since a couple of weeks. And maybe one of the positive elements at the review conference is that at least the TPNW was acknowledged, but nothing more. It was not welcomed, it was just acknowledged, its existence. I have the impression that the nuclear weapon states and the allies were surprised of the positive attitude by the TPNW members vis-à-vis the NPT. And the nuclear weapon states were afraid that it would be a polarizing issue at the NPT Review Conference, and it wasn't in the end.
You mentioned the doctrine of nuclear deterrence, and you're correctly said that's the basis of the understanding of the nuclear weapon states to keep their nuclear weapons. So it's already becoming a belief system. Of course, you cannot really scientifically prove whether it works or not, because you can't tell why something did not happen, why war, for example, during the Cold War did not happen. That's an assumption, of course. But nevertheless, that's the basis for the nuclear weapon states to keep their nuclear weapons. Their argument is they feel more secure with nuclear weapons. The proponents of the TPNW would say we are more secure without nuclear weapons. So both sides have their reasons. So it's a debate about the security concepts. So what would you tell those who cling, as you say, to the concept of nuclear deterrence? So what would you say to them that they are less secure with their nuclear weapons? Because they would argue, no, of course, not to keep them to be secure and to have a credible deterrence against the nuclear attack.
There are two major criticisms that can be made vis-à-vis the nuclear weapon states on this. One, if nuclear weapons are good for their security, that means that in the end, they are also prepared to use them if needed. And if the nuclear weapon states use these weapons of mass destruction, the consequences are also going beyond the borders of the nuclear weapon states. Also, the non-nuclear weapon states, the rest of the world, will feel the consequences of the catastrophic use of nuclear weapons. So this is a tension. That's one. And if the nuclear weapon states do not want to listen to what the non-nuclear weapon states want to say, then of course in the end it may have negative consequences for the NPT. I can come back to that. The second issue is, of course, the second criticism vis-à-vis the nuclear weapon states is if they argue that these nuclear weapons are important for their security, then of course what is the reason to deny others to say exactly the same? Why are we? Why should the nuclear weapon states argue with their finger? Iran do not get nuclear weapons because it's bad, while they are sitting on a pile of nuclear weapons themselves. That's not sustainable. That's not legitimate. And everybody knows that and feels that. So this is a two standards model that cannot be kept in term. So these are two major criticisms. And of course, it's hard for the nuclear weapon states to argue against, apart from saying that they apparently need nuclear weapons for their security. But we have, of course, to come up with an alternative for these nuclear weapons. And then I believe that you're lucky that there are new weapon systems coming up. Modern conventional weapons. Deterrence is not going to fade away. Deterrence always existed and will always exist. But the question is with what kind of means is the use in bello question. And if we can replace these weapons of mass destruction by less catastrophic weapon systems, conventional, very precise weapon systems like hypersonics, or you name it, cyber, then this may be an alternative for these currently nuclear weapon states that have to give up their nuclear weapons in the end. I'm writing a paper on this for the moment.
Also, there is this debate that Europe should become a little bit more independent in terms of arms control and in terms of security altogether. And we have a slowly emerging debate that European Union should itself become a nuclear power. Of course, there is no majority in the European Union member states. However, there is this debate in the context of the European the debate about the European army. If you have a European army, you have also, look at the consequences. The next step would be to have nuclear weapons and the nuclear deterrence to be more independent from the umbrella of the United States. Of course, that would mean the end of the Non-Proliferation Treaty because every European member states would become a nuclear weapon state by definition. So what would you argue to have if European Union would become a nuclear weapon power itself? What would be your arguments against, for it, maybe?
This is a very special issue that already exists since a long time. In the 1990s already, Chirac, the French president, after testing nuclear weapons, remember, offered this dissuasion concertée to the rest of Europe. And to my surprise, there was some interest in countries like Germany, in my own country, Belgium, not only in the conservative parties, like the Christian Democrats, but even the socialist parties. And the reason is, of course, indeed, a kind of prestige element, apart from security, but also prestige. If Europe is the biggest economic bloc in the world, then it needs that to be translated into political power and then also military power. And we are making progress little by little in the direction of a European army. And if we end up with a European army, the question has to be answered, will that be with or without nuclear weapons? Yeah? And thanks to the Brexit, we have only one nuclear weapon state left in the European Union, but this nuclear weapon state, France, is not thinking about giving up its nuclear weapons and might be interested in, for instance, co-financing by Germany. Also, practically speaking, we may already start working on a next fighter plane, Germany, France together for the 2040s. And the question then will come up, will that be a dual capable aircraft? France has the weapons, Germany has the money. But personally, I think that would be a wrong signal to the rest of the world. If Europe, again, sends a signal that nuclear weapons also are crucial for the European Union, then again, what argument do we have left for convincing states like Iran or others not to go nuclear?
That also begs the question about this nuclear sharing. So, of course, there are several states, including Belgium, who hosts American non-strategic nuclear weapons. Would that be a first step to give up nuclear sharing? Of course, nuclear weapon states would say we need this as a part of the umbrella and extended deterrence. But is there a reasonable argument to keep them on the territory of several European states, or would that the first step towards nuclear disarmament if you get rid of them?
From the logic of nuclear disarmament and the NPT, it would be logic and low-hanging fruit to take them away, at least back to the United States, and then we still have extended nuclear deterrence, like in Asia, Japan, South Korea, without nuclear sharing, without these tactical nuclear weapons stationed in these territories. For the moment, the United States is the only nuclear weapon state doing that. Maybe now Russia is doing the same in Belarus, so copy-paste. China may do that maybe in the future, and we won't like it. So I think there is no reason to keep these tactical nuclear weapons. Of course, the war in Ukraine will make it even more difficult to convince our politicians to get rid of them. You see that already in Germany. Germany defense budget is going up exponentially, and also buying F-35s. They made the decision now after the start of the war to buy F-35s, which are dual capable, which means in all likelihood that these P-61 tactical nuclear weapons will stay in Germany for a longer time. Except, but this is very unlikely, that the United States unilaterally decides to take them away as a gesture of goodwill vis-à-vis Russia after the war. But this is now, I think, even more unlikely than before the start of the war.
Another suggestion would be, because of course we have to be realistic that nuclear weapon states will not give up the nuclear weapons for this foreseeable future. Would be a compromise that the nuclear weapon states commit themselves to negative security assurances, not the promise legally binding not to use nuclear weapons or non-nuclear weapon states or threaten them by nuclear weapons. We do have this negative security assurances already enshrined in the
weapon-free zones.
Sorry, yeah, for the nuclear in the nuclear weapon-free zones with the protocols, and the protocols, of course, they have to be ratified also by the nuclear weapon states, and it's only the US only have ratified the nuclear weapon-free zone in Latin America, the Treaty of Tlatelolco. But would, to would that be a possibility as a compromise that the nuclear weapon states give negative security assurances to non-nuclear weapon states?
Well, it's not a compromise. It will be a step in the direction of nuclear elimination, such as was promised in the NPT. And there are more of these steps. There's this idea of a no first use or a sole purpose use, or de-alerting is another kind of idea, a step in the direction of nuclear elimination, because we will never get elimination from one day on another. It will be a step-by-step approach. But the problem is that these steps are not new. We are talking about this already from the 90s, since the 80s, or even before. We were talking about nuclear security assurances, no first use. And the nuclear weapon states have the chance to promise this every 5 years at the review conferences of the NPT. But they are not willing. And these ideas were proposed a couple of weeks ago again in New York at the review conference. And again, the nuclear weapon states refused to give legally binding negative security assurances. So it's not going to happen. Yeah? And then maybe let me answer one of your previous questions. What will be the fate of the NPT? Yeah? Because we are not making progress over the last 50 years. On the contrary, all these nuclear weapon states are modernizing their nuclear weapons. I think there is a real chance that, and here Iran will play a very important role. If Iran goes nuclear, then Saudi Arabia will follow, and other states in the Middle East, Egypt, Turkey, maybe in turn. We have a new arms race, and it will be the end of the NPT. Yeah. That can already happen very soon. Another scenario is that the NPT slides into irrelevance, like the Conference on Disarmament. I'm not the only one thinking this. More and more experts after this last review conference believe that we are in a state of apathy. And that the NPT will be less and less important in the future, and that the more important issues in the nuclear governance domain will be outside the NPT, like the TPNW, the ban treaty, or in the UN General Assembly, or something else, like a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East, outside of the NPT.
Yeah. Well, let me just ask you, because we're coming just closely to an end. You mentioned just the nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East, and that was the main controversial issue in the 2015 NPT Review Conference. And it is mentioned now in the draft document again. You were saying more or less there was a consensus, except this issue on Zaporizhzhia, on the text. But it mentions the nuclear weapon-free zone, Middle East. So would you say that's possible? Because several attempts in the past failed, and we had also this attempt from the Finnish facilitator 2012 to set up a conference. But would you say eventually all the states would agree on establishing a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East? After all, we have nuclear weapon-free zones in the north, in Central Asia, and in the south, Berlin Harbor. And there would be a huge zone of nuclear weapon-free zones if it would be possible to implement this. So Israel would be more secure because surrounded by non-nuclear weapon states. So the rationale of Israel's nuclear weapons would slowly disappear. So do you see any chance in the future that this will be accepted or is acceptable?
I may be wrong, but I'm very pessimistic on this. Israel was not there at the NPT conference. Israel is not a member of the NPT. It's one of the few outsiders, by the way. And Israel is the only state in the Middle East possessing nuclear weapons, not even willing to admit it. Yeah, but everybody knows. That puts pressure on other states to go nuclear as well. And as we are speaking, Iran is very, very close to having enough highly enriched uranium for a bomb. Maybe it has already enough highly enriched uranium for a nuclear bomb. It just has not taken the political decision to go the further mile, and make a nuclear weapon. But if they do, they can end up with a nuclear weapon in maybe 6 months or a year. Yeah. Now, I know that negotiations are still going on, and they may surprise me. But in my view, Iran and United States could have got a deal much sooner if they really had wanted to do so, and they didn't. So I would be surprised to see a deal. And even if there would be a JCPOA renewed in the coming days or weeks, then the question is for how long? There will be a new president in a couple of years' time in the United States, probably a Republican, maybe named Trump, and then he will do just exactly the same as he did in 2018, throwing this deal in the dustbin, And the Iranians are very distrustful of the Americans, and rightly so. So they're building up their program openly, secretly. So, and if Iran goes nuclear, which is really a possibility, in my view, then others will follow. Saudi Arabia has already said it will follow. And there are rumors that Turkey is also having a secret nuclear weapons program. So, and if Europe cannot do it, if Europe cannot say it is a weapons of mass destruction free zone, why would we expect from the Middle East, which is much more unstable, that they should do that and could do that?
So with this very actually pessimistic outlook when it comes to the abolishing of nuclear weapons, even though we have the TPNW, and you are hopeful that it will be successful in the future. But the situation right now in Europe and the Middle East is rather bleak to get rid of nuclear weapons. So let's hope there will be a JCPOA. Everybody would benefit, and it would be disastrous, as you described, if there would be none. So we would have another nuclear arms race and probably military interventions. So it will be decided, as I said, in the next couple of days or weeks. Thank you, Tom, so much for your insights. You demonstrated once again that you're a real expert on these issues. So nuclear disarmament, nuclear weapons, and also you're very knowledgeable about the details, but we could go on for a very long time. The issue will remain topical. We will have a longer debate now going on about nuclear weapons, and I'm sure we will come back to you to have another conversation with the International Institute for Peace, the Austrian Institute for International Affairs. All right, thank you so much, Tom, and see you soon again.
You're welcome.